Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us and attending the event today. Before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsors. Big shout out to making this event possible. Very much appreciated. And then with that, I will hand the microphone over to our guest speaker today, Ashley.
Great. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. So today we're going to talk about how to sell your business to your employees, right? The basic concept of employee ownership. And I'm here from the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. We're a nonprofit based in Denver. And our mission is to build a more just and sustainable economy through employee ownership. And you can see here we do that through multiple different types of programming. We help businesses that are already in existence go through a conversion to an employee ownership structure. We also do incubation of worker-owned cooperatives, which is one type of employee ownership we'll talk about today. So we can help people start those businesses from scratch. For any business going on the employee ownership journey, we do education through webinars and different academies to help people go in cohorts through that learning journey. And then we're always here for one-on-one technical assistance. And then we also contribute to research and policy for the employee ownership sector nationally as well. And just a quick little background about myself. I'm the statewide technical assistance director with RMEOC, and I've been supporting small businesses for more than 15 years. Before coming to RMEOC, I was actually in the Bay Area working for a network of 9 worker-owned cooperatives. And again, that's one type of ownership that we'll talk about today. And I was not only a worker owner at one of the businesses there that was a bakery, but then also worked for what's called the Development and Support Cooperative, which was doing back-end support to help those 9 businesses and also help start up new employee-owned businesses within that association and that network. But Colorado is actually home for me, so it was really exciting to be able to come back here and see Governor Polis putting a lot more energy around this about 4 or 5 years ago and join RMEOC to do this work. And a quick overview kind of agenda here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we will do and what we won't cover today, because this topic gets very specific very quickly, right, for each business and each situation. So today we're going to really talk about the high-level aspect, the benefits of employee ownership, some of the conversion structures that you can convert to, the transition pathway, what that looks for. We'll definitely leave time for questions. And then I have a bunch of resources for you to look at after this or to pick up whenever the time is ready. But today we won't dive deeply into any specific pathways, again, because the details are very different for every type of employee ownership. So today we just want to give you a broad overview, and we won't be able to decide in this much time, right, which path is right. But we're here anytime for help, and I'll show you some other resources at the end so that whenever you want to start diving into your own unique path, if this resonates with you, you'll know how to take those first steps. So really quick grounding, just what is employee ownership? And it's actually a proven business concept that's been around for a really long time in different forms since the mid-1800s. And really all we're talking about today is a type of ownership in which a broad base of the staff members that work there own a financial share of that business. And you'll see a lot of different ways of how that can manifest. But I always like to start this topic just really quickly grounding this in current challenges for business owners and businesses in general. And a term you may or may not have heard that we work a lot around is the silver tsunami, where we have the largest number ever in the history of the U.S. of businesses retiring because of the baby boomer generation having that ownership. And so lots of businesses are at risk to try to find new forms of ownership. Businesses are closing if they're not finding a new owner. That means jobs being lost, etc. And all of that overlaid over the last handful of years on the pandemic, impacts from COVID-19, companies shifting employee positions into contract positions have been happening for some time. And we see that BIPOC businesses, workers, and communities are being disproportionately affected by these impacts. So the potential of employee ownership is really great in these types of challenging times because it's about coming together with more people, right? Typically, there may be one or two owners of a company, and switching to employee ownership means that people are coming together to start something new. And it's a great path to explore, definitely before shutting down. And even if an owner is not looking to leave, it can be an option for selling to employees while staying on board to try to share in those benefits in the good times, but also to have more people there when these hard times do hit. And one of the most recent sort of historical markers we can look to was the 2008 financial crash. After that, we saw the number of worker cooperatives double in the US. And we see those trends now that a lot of people in those times of struggle are just looking for new ways to do things, right? Different ways to tackle problems. And so in those times, what's really cool, I think, about employee ownership is that you can really make a difference simply by doing what you do, right? Still doing the business that you're good at and continuing that pathway, but it can really connect you into an innovative model that is time tested, right? It's been along for a long time. So most of these models we're talking about are not new, but by engaging with them, you can become part of this innovative world of people coming together to run businesses together. And it can also help with fortifying the business for those times of challenge we were just talking about, and hopefully even be a source of revitalization. As you can imagine, with more people who work there connected and knowledgeable about the business, employee-owned businesses have greater longevity, increased productivity, and I'll show you some more statistics here in a minute. So again, before diving into the structures, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the benefits that you can see for any of the pathways to employee ownership. And I'll go through each one of these quickly here. So turning to some form of employee ownership can help you create a more resilient and stronger company. And you can see some of the statistics here. We see nationally right now that employee-owned companies have about an 8.5% higher profit margin when compared with traditional forms. They have 5% faster growth for sales and employment. They're 25% more likely to stay in business. And that worker co-op model that I've mentioned, just one type of ownership, 90% of those businesses are still in business after 5 years compared to about 20% of traditional companies. And I'm sure you can imagine why, just on the surface level. Again, more people involved, invested in the company, people tend to stay longer and help the company to a greater extent than being in an employee role. And one thing I always like to note here is that as we're talking about this today, you'll see that there's really two aspects of employee ownership. In some cases, it does mean the employees actually having a greater say in how the company is run. That's not across the board, but in some cases that's there. And all of them have an aspect of profit sharing, right? That's the key baseline, is that the employees get to share in those profits. And what we see is statistically, when those two things are combined, these numbers go up the highest. So it does help to have the employees having a voice in some form, whether it's required by the structure or not. Having the employees have more information and more say and more connection helps on all of these metrics. So also, if you are thinking about employee ownership, it can be a succession pathway, right? How to sell and leave a business. But also keep in mind, as you're listening today, we do have owners also that want to sell and stay on and be part of that new company. So it definitely doesn't mean that you have to do this switch at a time when you're leaving. Your employees are this incredible built-in buyer that are sitting there with you. So if it is a path for succession, these are some also realities to keep in mind, that right now, approximately 80% of business owners that try to sell actually do not find a buyer for their company. And we're seeing only about 15% of businesses transition within families. So selling to employees can create that natural buyer. right? That consistency, the jobs, the stability, not only for the community and the customers, but for the employees there. It's a great way to allow you to preserve your legacy, where the buyers are already the people that work there and know what the company is all about, rather than selling to somebody outside. And there are tax benefits for the company and the new owners in all of these pathways, and they do differ a lot. So again, today we're just going to talk about the quick overview, but keep that in mind. There will definitely be tax incentives to make this transition, no matter how you go down that path. And this was the other option I was talking about of staying as part of the business, again, or leaving. In either case, taking care of your employees is one benefit of moving down this path. And for all the reasons we've talked about, people being more engaged, etc., companies tend to have higher wages, better benefits. And in the cases where employees do have a vote, they sometimes do get to actually participate in the decision making of the company, which can really help with the overall company health. And the employee owners, statistically here, you can see, they're having higher household net worth, higher median incomes, and tend to stay in their jobs longer because those jobs tend to be more interesting, right? They're connected into the company and can potentially be learning a lot about how to be a business owner while they're doing their job, where in other cases they might leave, right, to take that next step or gain new skills. In employee ownership, you can really build that in at the baseline of the work that they do. And a quick note here, one of the benefits also, if you happen to be connected to a micro business, even of one or two people, definitely keep this in mind, because coming together or expanding through these forms, especially the worker cooperative form, can be a really great benefit for the business. So you could look to similar businesses to look to combine into one new company, and or even just look to work together to share things like space. We have some cooperatives that actually share employees that might transfer from different companies for different types of seasonality, things like that, sharing marketing budgets, things like that. So we can definitely help you explore this, even if you're on that very, very small end of operations. And now just a quick note about the tax incentives. I'm just going to talk about two examples here, but across the board, there are significant tax benefits for this type of ownership. And an ESOP is another type of employee ownership we'll talk about today. Owners avoid double taxation on corporate earnings for that percentage of ownership that's in the ESOP. Another one you might hear about is Code 1042, which allows someone to sell a C corporation to a worker co-op with resulting favorable tax treatment. And for each of these pathways, this gets way more defined based on the business specifics and then the actual pathway that you choose for employee ownership. But all of that stuff we can help you with. And we tend to work in concert with an attorney and a CPA at the bare minimum for all of these pathways. That's really the team that we need in place. And since we have a small group, I'll just stop for 1 second before I move into the actual structures and see if there's any questions or thoughts.
When you said you work with an attorney, you mean the attorney for the company? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So if the company already has an attorney they work with, we can often bring that person in, or we have employee-owned specific, specialists that really focus on these types of structures. And so we'll often bring them in as part of the team to support the business on this pathway. So they'd be working directly with the business, but we often stay involved to help keep that process going. But we're lucky in Colorado to have multiple specialists now that are lawyers that know these exact forms. So they're not recreating the wheel, trying to learn about the structure as they're helping you through that process.
So just a caveat on what he was saying. So it could be an in tandem process, obviously, where is there ever a reason that the employees would have separate representation versus the employer, for instance?
Yeah, it's a great question. That does happen fairly often, actually, just to make sure that everybody is getting their voice heard, and especially if there's any negotiation around the actual cost of the business. Because in all of these cases, for the most part, there is still a sale happening. And I'll explain a little bit about that. But again, we start to get into details because it's different for every structure. But in every case, the employees would be buying the business from the owner, just like it was an outside buyer. So oftentimes the employees might want someone to represent them in that final negotiation around what that deal looks like. And also to be looking at the tax advantages. Also, sometimes it's helpful for a lawyer and a CPA to really be assessing the situation of that group of employees and or the selling owners, and have separate lawyers, since they have that. There's a limit to how much the lawyer can start to answer questions on both sides of the table. Exactly what you're getting at.
My company has fewer than 10 employees. I was wondering whether there are particular hazards or benefits or problems associated with having such a small ownership group.
No, actually, and you'll see I'll delineate that in some of these actual structures, which ones are more suited to smaller sizes or bigger size companies. But in a lot of cases, having that small ownership is fantastic because you can actually think about including everybody and still have a fairly efficient process for decision making. And that's something specifically in the worker cooperative realm that a lot of people have spent a lot of time on trying to get that to be an efficient process so that the company doesn't get bogged down by having too many voices in the mix.
So you recommend selling to a cooperative which has membership among the employees as opposed to selling one share to each of the employees. And when we have a small business, having like 8 employees and maybe some of them have 2 shares, some of them have 1 share, et cetera. What about that alternative?
Yeah, so those are both alternatives, and I'll talk about those. There's really 3 main pathways we're going to talk about, and both of those options are fine to consider, and you would see benefits to one or the other. But for a company of 10 or less, yes, likely a worker co-op structure, or what we are now sort of calling statewide an alternative equity structure, where the employees would own different portions of the equity. One of those 2 paths would be most likely a good way to go.
Thank you.
Yeah. And you can see here, this is a great transition to this slide, actually. This is Namaste Solar, you may have heard about in the Denver and Boulder area. They've had upwards of 200 worker owners who all actually, it is a worker co-op, so they all do have a direct voice and a direct vote in how the company runs. And it's not come without challenges, but they have been able to maintain that with around that many members having a say in the ownership. So it's a really inspiring example we have here in Colorado.
Is there's a cooperative or equal shares, or is it similar to what Jim was asking, where they have different shares for different owners or different employees?
At a baseline level, a cooperative does mean equal ownership, so that the total ownership is just divided by the number of people, and profit sharing is typically distributed based on the hours that people contribute. But there are other ways to structure that. If it's not a full cooperative, you can divide up the equity amongst the employees and weight it in different ways. That makes sense to you if people have been there longer, et cetera. So those are 2 great options for smaller companies, and both have kind of pros or cons. Namaste is a cooperative, so it's equal ownership.
So I'm sorry, to dive into that. So that would mean, like, for instance, the operation manager would get the same amount of profit as somebody that just does raking.
Yep,
just
exactly.
Really example. So I guess that might cause problems in certain organizations. So I'm going to let you finish.
Okay, cool. But yeah, it's a good thing to keep in mind. But that is what we're talking about in the worker co-op structure, and that really ties back into a lot of the conceptual part of the benefits, right? Having everybody in a company connect in a more deep way does tend to have benefits for those jobs and for the company. One thing, though, to remember is in all these cases, the salaries or hourly wage, those can remain hierarchical and based on roles and all of that. So all we're talking about in that case would be the profit sharing. There are some co-ops that do have flat wages as well, but that doesn't have to be the case. And then also remember, I'm just going to talk about this on this slide too. Even in a worker co-op where there's equal ownership, it does not mean that everybody has to be an owner. A lot of cooperatives would have, say, 5 out of 15 people who are owners, and then there's just a pathway for people to come in. But cooperatives can have traditional employees like any other company. So you can define that ownership path and have people working there that are not in that group. But it does mean in that example that those 5 employees who are owners, they would have equal ownership of the company. And so this leads right into where I was going to go. There are 2 different ways to sell to employees, right? To sell to those key employees or managers is one way to go, as Jim brought up, that direction, and you can weight the ownership. Or you can sell to a broader group through an ESOP, the worker cooperative, or these other alternative equity structures as well. So often when you hear about employee ownership, you're hearing about this broad-based ownership, but there are lots of ways to bring it back down and start by selling to key employees. And lots of companies do this transition over time. So also keep that in mind. You don't have to make a switch, say, to a worker cooperative in one swoop. You can start down the path of selling some of the equity to some employees and start building to that. And there's pathways to do that sharing over time.
And not to get you into the weeds, and we can talk later, but obviously tax benefits might be also part of that equation, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I'd say the tax equation, and then really overall, it's more of that control piece too. So those are 2 big pieces. Like when you're ready to make this transition, how much control do you want to give up in one swoop? Because in a co-op conversion, literally the owner is passing the company on. If they're going to stay, they would be then an equal vote with all of those co-owners in one transaction. Whereas other stair-stepped ways could allow you to maintain still a majority control and start to bring in people over time more slowly. So here's these 3 types of employee ownership, and I always like to think of them really in these 3 categories for simplification, because when you start searching for employee ownership, it can sometimes feel, I'm guessing, a little overwhelming to know what it all means and what is employee ownership. But you can really think of it in these 3 groups. The worker co-op we've talked about, the ESOP I've mentioned, those are each unique structures where you're literally changing the structure of the company to one of those entities. Whereas this third bucket called alternative equity structures includes all different sorts of forms, and these types can take place without having to actually change the company to any kind of other structure, but you just start to share the equity with the employees, and that can be through stock or profit sharing programs. There's a somewhat newer form that we're all learning a lot about right now called employee-owned trusts that's shaping up to be a really great new-ish model. It's very tested in the United Kingdom. There's lots of examples, but it's relatively new in the US for people to be looking at that structure. So as you can see, lots of variations, but I think it can help to start thinking about them in these 3 groups and seeing which pathway might feel like the best fit. So the worker-owned co-op, as I mentioned, is its whole own entity. In Colorado, we have 2 different structures now within the Secretary of State that you can go and incorporate as or convert to. And this is the one I mentioned, has 100% employee ownership, and it includes these democratic values where workers literally own the business. And the 2 defining pieces are that they have an equal vote, meaning nobody has more or less say in governance, and they share in the profits equitably. And again, to note, this is only about the governance. It doesn't mean everybody has a say in everything. Sometimes that gets translated and feels overwhelming, but we're talking about just the ownership level. The company day to day can look just like it does now. It can have hierarchy. It can have managers, CEOs, etc. But it's starting to think about it as though everybody has two hats, really. Like you have your operations, your worker hat, and then when you come into the boardroom or an owner meeting, you're putting on this other hat, and somebody who might be, not at all in management, who has ownership, might be in the same room making the same decision with somebody who is running the company on the day-to-day level. Then there's lots of systems and structures in place to help the workers understand how to make that happen, how that shift works. And this one's great because it is appropriate for any size company, and it does have a relatively low cost for setting up. All these pathways are going to have some kind of cost associated with them, and you'll see the difference. But this is a relatively low cost one because it is its own fairly simple entity structure. And you'll see compared to an ESOP, it's not connected into any sort of federal regulation of how the profits are being shared, etc.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
does the owner sell the business to the co-op and get money for the sale? And where does that money come from? Are the members of the co-op putting in money or what?
Yep, exactly how you described. This would be just as though, so the owner would take on two roles if staying involved. If leaving, it's more like a traditional sale. If staying, the owner might sell but stay a part of the new cooperative. And the funding is something we help with a lot. The employees do need to find that funding somewhere. The usual ways we see it happening would be that the owner actually finances the amount. So there's an agreement and a sale, but the employees pay the selling owner back over time for that company. There's also lending specifically for worker-owned cooperatives that we have connections into nationally. So the employees may take out a loan either for the full amount or for a portion. And then the deal typically gets structured through those two forms. And the employees do need to bring something to the table. But as you can imagine, it's oftentimes very rare that employees suddenly are sitting there with money to buy a business if they weren't working towards that anyway. So that's what the whole sector of support really helps, is how do we get the employees that funding to buy the business.
When a new employee joins, do they need to pay to buy into the co-op? And then if they retire, do they sell and get some of their money back? How does that work?
Yeah, so they do need to have a buy-in. So the founding owners would need to have some kind of personal buy-in, as well as any owner buying in. But it's actually more similar to something like a law firm in terms of leaving, where it's kind of like when you're in, and when you're out, you're out. And you do get that buy-in back, the amount that you put in, and then you would get any profits that you've amassed during your time there. But it's not as though you're selling your share, other than those two aspects of it.
Okay, continue.
Okay. This is a great example on the Western Slope. Fly and Miata, it was two founding owners who had owned the business for 30 some years, and they sold to 8 of 15 employees. This was about 2 years ago. And then just to show the different industries, this is another company, an interior design company in Denver. They're both the women-owned and an employee-owned co-op now, and they converted as well from traditional ownership. And now switching gears to the ESOP structure, this is probably the one you've maybe heard about. It's the most common in the country. And it basically means that, so this is in itself completely different than a co-op. It's its own structure, though. And in this one, the ESOP employees own shares of the company through a trust. And the company is going to make contributions into that plan, typically based on a percent of wages. And this would be most similar to what a 401k plan. So the ownership is held in this trust that is connected into a retirement benefit. Another note on the gradual formation, an ESOP can hold 100% or less of the company's stock, so this one doesn't have to be a full switch. And this one is more advantageous for larger companies because of the cost of setting it up. You can see, we hear everything from 75 to 150,000 or more to set up. But the tax benefits of this are fantastic for the selling owner, for the company as well. This one's been around a very long time. It does require annual valuations as well. So just because the trust itself is connected into ERISA and the federal level of retirement functioning and tax requirements, it's a heavier lift administratively to implement and to maintain. So we tend to see it for larger companies, although we see all kinds of variations. So this is something to definitely inquire about if it fits the general model, and we can always connect you with specialists who can really talk about the details and see where that line would be of whether it makes financial sense to go forward with this based on the scale and the size. And one great example of this is in Durango. It's actually multinational company based there doing tool manufacturing. They are a very successful ESOP that we have. And on a kind of totally different scale, we have Applewood Seed Company, a smaller ESOP there in Arvada. And they sell, they're a wholesale supplier of seeds and switched to an ESOP several years ago. The third bucket here, this other type of EO companies, which now the state is really defining as what they're calling an AES, just as of recent figuring for a new tax credit that's coming in. So there's alternative equity structures. As I mentioned, there's lots of different pathways, so I'm not going to get into too many details today. But definitely reach out to us. Also, I'll give you a resource of the Colorado Employee Ownership Office, and that we can start you down this path with the necessary info to explore whether this would be a long-term plan that can happen, or this would be a switch you'd make that would hold for the future, or if you're looking at it as a gradual path potentially to a worker co-op or an ESOP ownership long-term. These are great options. And one example you might be familiar with is Palmer Flowers with multiple locations. They have converted to a stock option plan to help the employees there. And now just a couple, I'll back up 1 second here. Just wanted to show you a few of the logos of employee-owned companies. Some you may be familiar with, not know they're employee-owned. And then just a quick overview of all of the companies in Colorado. We estimate there are around 200 or so employee-owned companies of all these different structures in Colorado. And in the country right now, there's about 7,000. And just for reference, around 6,500 of those are ESOPs, worker co-ops, or somewhere between 600 and 1,000. And then the AESs, we don't have too much data on since they're privately held. But you can really see the bulk of those are still ESOPs, and then the worker co-ops and those other forms are mixed in there. So thinking about some challenges as we switch now from the structures to the actual pathway. As many of you might know, having come here today, like starting to think about this, one of the biggest challenges is that you do have to define your own path, right? Because there's so many different options for private business owners, it can be hard to figure that out. And then just awareness, which is why we do this today. And it's just great to have this information recorded and out there. Is you have to be aware of the options. That's the first place to start to overcome those challenges. Finding time to research this is always very hard for people to add in to the challenges of running a business. And then the costs that I mentioned. Every path has associated costs, but more and more we are finding that government and different entities are helping employees to be the buyers, to be the other side of this transaction. And we can definitely help with that. And I'll show you in a little while, Colorado is really leading the country right now on that support for employee-owned businesses. So it's a great state to be in for looking at this path. And here's the kind of phases that we want to go through for any of this. And you're all here in that exploring phase, most likely. You're just trying to look at what are all these options. And that's what we can continue to help with. I have some other resources at the end you would next, for any direction, move into an assessment phase. For instance, for a worker co-op, that might be a feasibility study first to look at that. ESOPs as well. You're going to look at the financial and the organizational feasibility. Then the structuring phase is where we're really bringing in the other team, of an attorney, CPA, most likely, to figure out that structure. What is the exact right form that works best for you? And then executing the actual conversion, that transaction, and then you move into the support phase. How do you run an employee-owned business? And one of the first notions to really start thinking about at this point is this business saleable, right? Where am I at in terms of what value this would be for the employees or for any buyer? First thing is thinking about financial records. That's going to be important in any pathway. Are tax returns up to date? Do you have profit and loss and balance sheets that people can look at to be able to pull that financial picture pretty quickly to check into that? So then the cash flow, thinking about that. Is there a profit right now? Things like, are you paid a market rate salary right now as the owner, and what might that look like for transitioning that role to the employees? And then operations is the other piece of this. Just really starting to think early, can this business survive without you? What would that look like to replace the work that you do as the owner? And then our agreements and things transferable, those will all play in, just like any sale. Leases might have to be transferred, those sorts of things. And especially if outside lending is going to play in, then that new co-op, the group of employees who would buy the company, would then be looking at any kind of traditional loan process to go through that. But that's all things we are here and other entities are there to support the employees, because we realize that's one of the challenges is that for this whole sector is that the employees often are there without previous business knowledge and might just be being given this opportunity kind of out of the blue, right? They join the company, maybe never thinking that they would actually be an owner. So that's where a lot of the work needs to be done, is in that education and exploration of whether this team of employees is the right team and can take this on.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a really valid, important point, because I've been doing this for 20 years, and I find sometimes when you put somebody into a position of leadership, they might not be prepared for. So that's great. That's a huge element of what this process looks like.
Yeah, for sure.
That's awesome.
And it's interesting you're saying it, because when I came into this world, I was more on the startup side and came into learning about conversions. And in my more entrepreneurial brain, I was thinking, oh, who wouldn't want to do that, right? You get turned around and given a business, but that is so not the case across the board. And I very quickly learned that beginning introduction and assessment is so key to make sure that everybody is in the right place and it is that right group before you invest time and resources. So we've done a lot of research into really forefronting that feasibility aspect before moving too far down the path, because it's not the right fit for everybody. And you really do need to think about that, not on this conceptual level, like it's all just good, but rather for this specific group and for this company and its financial future, is it the right move for the sale? So these are just a few other readiness factors. I won't go into them for details, but we will have this recorded, and I've shared the slides already on the Google Drive, so you'll have all of these links and details. And I think everything on the left, those top 4 ones, are pretty intuitive, right? Financial health, we've talked about. Committed owners and employees on the other side, and then that proven business track record becomes important again for the lending in terms of the investment to make the sale happen. This is some of the state funding I wanted to forefront. It's really incredible that we have this much to help businesses actually through the conversion costs. So these would go towards any costs of people like us working for technical assistance, attorney costs, CPA costs, anything that it takes for you to get through this process. There's this $3,000 grant that can go to reimburse those expenses that you pay. And now there's an employee ownership tax credit, which is actually just getting expanded. These are the new amounts that will go into effect in January. And it covers up to 50% of those costs. So whatever, 50% is plus this 3,000 is going to come straight from the state. And that can be up to $40,000 for worker co-ops and those EO trusts I mentioned, up to $150,000 for ESOP conversions, and $25,000 for these AES structures. And this is new, just starting in January. So any company that switches 20% or more of its equity to the employees can get this tax credit now to cover any of the costs, or 50% of those costs to make that move. And or it can be utilized more than once, right? If you do 20% now, you can reapply if you add another 20% in the future. So again, we're very lucky to be here in Colorado with the support that Polis really initiated. And now we have the EO office in the governor's office and an employee ownership commission that's very active and helping on the business front. So this is just a little bit more. We're here to help you as kind of that center point for starting this conversation. And then we just work with a broad network of providers to help you down these different paths. In terms of literal next steps, one of the best things you can do is go to the employee ownership office, their website. This is new this past year. We worked with them and lots of other people, and they implemented this really awesome class, basically a free intro course that's going to allow you to have a specific pathway of learning to go deeper into all these directions that I opened up today and learn some more details about the different structures. So on this website, it's free. You can do it on your own time, and it just walks you through some more learning to start to do that assessment and exploration phase. So that's a really good next step. If this is of interest, take that course. Also, at the end of that course, you'll be connected with the state consultant that's there. Right now, it's Matt Lucina, and he will also then know that you're there looking for resources and connect you with any kind of support resources they know of. You're also welcome to contact me anytime, and we do free hour consultations. So we take it to that next step, kind of starting with this general learning. I'd learn more about your business, and we can start to come up with a plan to narrow down which of those options is right and go from there. And then a little bit more detail about that. If an ESOP seems like it is the right direction, we pretty quickly then partner with an actual ESOP expert. There's whole firms that focus and work on this. So pretty quickly, we would be connecting you with those companies for all the support that you'd need down that path. For alternative equity structures, we have a really good network of legal experts to talk to you on the structure side. And then we often stay involved on more of the cultural side for that, because it's not built into the structure, as I mentioned, right? It's just how do you start to switch this ownership? What we do find, though, is that it can be really helpful to not just have it be a piece of paper switch that one day you're saying to the employees, you own 20%. So we often work to help you define for your company, what does that mean? What of these aspects of maybe democratic collaboration or, having some input on meetings or sharing information more broadly might be helpful for the company, and to make that whole shift more meaningful to the employees rather than simply seeing that profit sharing coming to them. And then the worker-owned co-ops is the structure that we most specialize in internally for our MEOC. So in that case, if that looks like a good fit, we can do a full financial feasibility analysis in-house with our team. And also we would be then doing a look at all of the organizational side of things, interviewing the employees, the different people involved, and we produce a report that you can use for moving forward in the process. And then our phase 2 would be connecting with funding sources to help with that transaction, comprehensive ownership education, as I mentioned. Where are the employees starting? What do they need to know? And then the connection with those other service providers as needed. So we can walk you through that whole process. And then the actual conversion would happen. And then you move into that support phase.
Wow, I have to say, like, I wish this was 2 hours long. Honestly, like, that was a lot of information, really well put in a very succinct way. And thank you so much. My goodness. Like, we should, as GBC, talk about having you do a longer form of this. I'm just going to throw that out there. This is it. There was so much stuff that I had no idea about.
Oh, good. I'm so glad.
Especially that Colorado is like at the top of the, like, you know, the states of doing this this kind of collective. So wow.
Yeah. And it is relatively new. And it's, you know, this all of this energy and effort and funding is really only, you know, 5 to 8-ish years old of all that energy. So I think we are still trying to get the word out to everybody that all of this exists. And yeah, as you can see, the details we could go into so much on any of these paths. But hopefully that made sense. And I think trying to just focus on it as, like, there are really only 3 main areas of employee ownership, really, that you would start to drill down into. Hopefully it gives you that starting point where it doesn't feel overwhelming and just like this vague concept of what that means. And these are some resources both on a national level and on a local level that can be of more help to reach out to for all the different forms of ownership.
Great.
I think we have a couple minutes. If anyone has specific questions, I'm happy to field those. You're welcome to contact me anytime. This is our website, and then also that the Colorado Employee Ownership Office, they have a ton of other resources as well.
Thank you, Ashley. That was incredible.
You guys have got a link for a survey if you're interested in taking it before you leave. I'm going to post it in the chat here. And then otherwise, thank you, everybody, for participating. And I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Yes, thank you all for being here.
Bye, guys.
Take care.